Welcome to TypeScript FM, the friendly podcast for TypeScript developers where we bring you news, updates, and interviews from the community with plenty of tomfoolery sprinkled in. I'm your host, Kamran and Erik, and I'm joined by my co-host and best bud, Erik Onerheim. Together, we're the two TypeScript fools. Welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Hey, hey.
Hey, hey, hey.
How are you, dear listener? Oh, you can't answer me. How are you, Erik? You can answer me.
I'm doing pretty good. It was a busy weekend. A lot happened in the last week. For me, my daughter finally started swim class. We've been very sick, so we had to cancel 4 times.
Oh.
But now we're in swim class and she hates it.
She's not a fan.
No, I don't think anyone likes it in the beginning, but I think it's a really important life skill to be able to swim. So
now, is that because we did the same thing with our kids? Are you doing parent in the water? Obviously,
yes.
with the kid. Yep.
Yeah.
Ours kind of enjoyed it. I guess they weren't big fans of it when they were infants, but when they were toddlers, they liked it. And then we put them in there once they were like 5 and they could just be there on their own, and they really enjoyed that.
Oh yeah, we definitely like bath time. She does like water.
Mm-hmm.
She also likes dumping out her cups and playing with water. So I feel like she'll warm up to the pool.
No, that's good
soon.
Because I know a 40-year-old man who doesn't know how to swim. I think we want to avoid that situation.
Yeah. I think it's just important just for life. The other thing is I was fortunate enough to be at the Front-End Masters accessibility course taping this last week.
Ooh.
Which was really good. I recommend anyone check out Front-End Masters. And if you're in the Twin Cities, going to the tapings is a lot of fun. A lot of good nuggets there. The things you would expect, like real briefly, semantic HTML gets you really far in accessibility. Definitely recommend checking out that course. And then my brother got engaged.
Oh, congrats.
He's affianced. He went to Paris and got engaged by the Eiffel Tower. So that's like classic move.
Oh, yeah. Nice. I actually have a funny story about that with my brother because he went to Paris with his now fiance, but at the time girlfriend, last summer. And he did not actually propose in France. He proposed afterwards. And you know why? It's because he had to order the ring and the ring did not come in time. So he didn't have it with him in Paris. No. And it was really funny because I'm like, bro, it's okay. You're in Paris. Just do it. It's fine. You don't need the ring. She loves you anyway. Don't worry about it. But he wanted to wait till he had the ring. So he did. But anyway, we just thought it was funny that they went to Paris and France and he didn't actually propose there.
Funny story is as soon as my brother was like, he's like, hey, I'm going to go to Paris. And I called him immediately. And I was like, you're proposing, right? Because if you're not, you need a backup plan. And he's like, no, I'm proposing. What do you think? I'm like, good.
That's awesome. We enjoyed the really nice weekend because if you've been in Minnesota in the past week, it's been a polar vortex, right? So we've had negative temperatures. It got up to like negative 45, wind chill, I should say. And so school was canceled on like Tuesday. We basically couldn't go outside to do anything. But finally by Friday and then Saturday and Sunday, it's been in the 40s. And so we've just been maximizing our time outside. We went to a winter play day. We did some cross-country skiing. We did snowshoeing. We did playing on big snow mountain type stuff. We walked around on trails. So just trying to maximize getting outside.
Yeah, it's so funny here in Minnesota. Like as soon as we get above freezing temperatures, everyone's walking outside with shorts and t-shirts. And it's 40 degrees out right now. So 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's just so funny because like in the beginning of fall, everyone's bundled up and then 40 degrees feels really cold. And now it feels extremely warm to us. So it's so funny.
We grill in like sub-zero temperatures. I have the grill sitting right outside my back door. So even when it's snowing outside, we'll grill just because we got to grill. We only have 3 months out of the year where we can really grill.
Yeah, we're maniacs here.
TypeScript FM is sponsored by Excalibur.js, the friendly TypeScript game engine for the web. Like many of you, I got into computers because I loved video games and dreamed of making one, but game development always felt a bit intimidating. Instead, I built a career in web development, though that dream of making games never really went away. Then I met Erik, who showed me I could use my HTML, CSS, and JavaScript skills to create games with just a bit of game design knowledge and the right engine. Excalibur.js makes game development approachable, offering everything you need to build 2D web games. Arcade physics, sprites, animations, input support, and integrations with tools like Tiled and Sprite. It's beginner-friendly, yet flexible enough to grow with you. Our team has published 10 games using Excalibur, all written in TypeScript. If you're a web developer looking to dip your toes into game dev or sharpen your TypeScript skills, give Excalibur.js a try at excalibur.js.com. Click the big tutorial button to start building your first game, Excalibur, a Flappy Bird clone. After that, join our friendly Discord community of web developers who love to help each other and share game dev tips. Sweet, on to the news. What's new in the world of TypeScript, Erik?
Yeah, a bit of small news this week. It was kind of a slow news week, believe it or not. But Ember 6.2 dropped with a couple bug fixes and a couple features. And I was like, oh, I haven't thought about Ember in 1,000 years. And I was like, I wonder what it's like to do Ember. And honestly, I can't say I know what it's like to do Ember nowadays. But looking at it, it looks like a very robust alternative to like modern Angular. So if you were like in the Angular zone and you're like, oh, let's try something new, maybe take a look at Ember. Maybe like this new version is the thing that you want or need.
Mm-hmm.
But buyer beware, I haven't used Ember ever. So just something that came across the desk.
Yeah, I have not used Ember either, but I've definitely heard of it. I was just looking briefly on their homepage and stuff just to see what's going on with them. And it seems like they can compile templates into a virtual machine. And I don't know how that works and stuff, but apparently it helps a lot with performance. So maybe they're doing some fancy WASM runtime stuff. I'm just speculating there. No idea. But just another alternative, and they obviously support TypeScript. So if you want to use a full-on framework, Ember might be a nice choice.
Yeah. And next up in the news is Deno 2.2 dropped.
Woo!
And they have a lot of goodies. So one thing that it was really big for me, and if you have ever worked with me, but I'm big on observability, they've added built-in open telemetry to Deno. I was going to say Node. So that's super cool. So like you can get that traceability throughout your entire stack now in Deno.
So just quick for people, because I actually saw on Blue Sky, a few people didn't know what open telemetry was. Do you want to explain that for a second?
Oh, that's actually a great question. Open telemetry is where the industry has landed as far as like tracing requests across different processes. So you're like, hey, user A is using your app. They might bounce through 6, 7, 8 different systems on their way to complete a task. And in the old world order, you had to like maybe correlate that behavior with like logs. And open telemetry gives you a way of having a trace across all of these systems and then visualizing it in like something like Jaeger, or so there's some paid tools as well. But you can visualize user transactions over a period of time. So if you have suddenly slow transactions, you can be like, oh, you can point your finger really quickly at the problem.
Yeah.
And so it's super, super useful. Open telemetry is more than just traces, but that's probably where you're going to first. Other things that they added is there's the new Deno lint plugin API, which is very similar it's reminiscent of ESLint. It's not ESLint, but it's very reminiscent. So if you want to make your own Deno lint plugins, you can now. So like when you're doing your Deno linting, which is neat because that extensibility wasn't necessarily there, right? There's also now Deno check, which is the type check in Deno, will work with JSDoc @import commands. Previously they did not. So they were just, if I'm remembering, they're just any. I just didn't know what @import meant. This is actually super cool. You can now use wildcards in task names in Deno task. So you can be like, hey, run me all the dev -star tasks.
Okay.
And you can just go to town. You can also run tasks without commands. So this is a really slick way of doing like parallel commands at once. So if you've done this, you might have used parallel or concurrently. Currently, I'm using concurrently in my NPM package to run multiple tasks at once. But this is a cool way of doing parallel tasks inside of Deno just natively. So you don't need an extra package to do it.
Nice.
They added a new outdated mode. outdated interactive mode. So you can go through all of your outdated dependencies and go interactively one by one versus update all my things and cross your fingers and pray. So that's pretty slick. This one's exciting. This next one is they added Node SQLite support. Now, previously, this was not the case. They didn't have Node SQLite. Now they have the Node SQLite API supported, which is super cool.
Oh, just one thing on that Deno outdated command. I actually had to go back into one of my code bases for my upcoming lab, and I had to figure out what package versions I needed to update, and I had like 12. And so I was like, where's the npm outdated command? Okay, so there is an npm outdated command, but it doesn't do an upgrade. There's no switch to be like, do the upgrade. Like, thank you for telling me what's out of date. Please update it.
Yes.
So you can, you're supposed to get an extra package, and then that one enables you to do a full scale. Like you can just upgrade all the packages. But again, just going back to Deno's integrated toolchain, that DX, now that's just built into Deno. So you don't need an extra go find a package. I had to Google, like, how do I update all my packages in NPM? And the results are like, use this other package. I'm like, okay, great. I can do that. And I did that and it works, but it's just nice that Deno just has it out of the box.
Oh, speaking of, if you're a VS Code enjoyer, there is a plugin to that same effect called Package JSON Upgrade from Code and Stuff. I'll add a link to the show notes, but I use this in VS Code. It'll just give you in-editor hints of like things that are out of date, and then you'll get a quick code action if you want to upgrade it or whatever.
Cool.
So
nice.
It's super slick. I'll add that to the show notes. But you can also get a similar thing in NeoVim. And I forget the name of that NeoVim plugin that I use now, but I'll add it to the show notes. So if you're in NeoVim or in VS Code, you can get that hint inside your editor, and you can just update things in NPM, which is super slick. Coming up is Deno Compile. You now get a summary of all the included files and their sizes, so you can see like what's contributing to your size in your Deno Compile. Like if you've ever done like the NPM like dry run, you see all that whole manifest of stuff that's included in your package. It looks a lot like that. They made a couple small improvements on Mac OS to make the binaries 5 megabytes smaller. And then they also added some improvements to make reading files that are bundled inside of the binary about 40% faster. So that's all around real good news. Like just huge improvements every release. It's just very exciting. More goodies. If you didn't believe that there's more and more goodies, I talked in a previous episode about Deno Bench, and Deno Bench is like a really slick way of doing like JavaScript benchmarking. If you remember, like all of these old JS perf, I think has gone now, but all of these old websites for rocking JavaScript to see what's faster, they've now added a way to configure the warmup. So like before there was just a default warmup for Deno, and now you can twiddle those bits. So you can say, okay, warm up this many times, run for this long, iterate this many times, and warm up the JIT in V8. Because if you have code that's just not warmed up, and it'll behave differently. So this is a way to get consistent results, especially if you're looking at something in a hot loop. So that's pretty cool. Next is experimental support for HTTP3, which is the Web Transport API. And HTTP3 and Quick are basically the same as far as I know, but the idea is it's over UDP. The idea is that modern networks are pretty reliable, so we don't need full duplex like TCP to transmit data. So it does improve speed of data over the web, since networks nowadays are pretty reliable from the past where we needed TCP.
So this is the Quick protocol, which is QUIC.
Yep.
And is that part of HTTP 3?
I think Quick, if I remembered my history right, okay, asterisk, Quick was invented by Google because they were like, yo, this stuff ain't fast enough. So Quick came before HTTP 3, and HTTP 3 was like, oh, I think we messed up with HTTP 2. So they were like, okay, the Quick seems to be working pretty well. Let's do that. So as far as I know, HTTP 3 and Quick are very similar.
Okay.
I probably should know more about that as a person who runs websites, but I haven't thought about it in a long time because I just use other people's load balancers and they handle it for me.
Yep. That's okay. It feels like HTTP 2 is still, we just covered how it doesn't have full support in every runtime quite yet. So it feels like HTTP 2 is still stabilizing. Now we've got HTTP 3 coming down the pipe. So
yeah. And then I think the last thing that I'll include is they've added a bunch more Node and NPM improvements, a lot of miscellaneous things like more API coverage on Node compat, and then more NPM improvements. So more NPM packages are supported.
Are they getting up there with Bun in terms of API % coverage?
I have to go and look again. And this is why I think it's harkening back to a previous sentiment that I had, is I really think it's hard to say if Bun or Deno is going to be better for your app, because it's going to be such a moving target for a long time, because they are both highly incented to do the best they can. So they're just going to be trading blows, as far as I can tell, in terms of support. So I think what really matters is your experience running a project in Deno or Bun or Node and being like, okay, this is good for these reasons that are maybe intangibles. That would be my advice.
Yep. And they've got some new TS support. Is that right?
Yeah, they just revved that new Deno release to the latest TypeScript. And as of this recording, it was 5.7. I think 5.8 is going to land soon, but not yet. And then they revved 8, which is the JavaScript engine inside of Deno, to 13.4. And that just comes with a lot of performance improvements, security improvements, nothing too groundbreaking, earth-shattering there.
That's cool. So a lot of nice, exciting stuff in 2.2. That's pretty sweet. We've got some neat community things happening that came across our feeds on Blue Sky. One of them is potentially an interesting hot take, which is, what if you wrote your SQL stored procedures in TypeScript? James Cowling did a talk, and I have linked to his YouTube video recording of that talk. So if that sounds interesting / maybe scary, you can go check out that video. And then we talked a few times now about all these new JS runtimes and compatibility with Node APIs, and almost none of them are 100% compatible. Some are getting really close. So community member Puya made a test suite showing the compatibility of all the JS runtimes with Node APIs. So this could be really helpful if you're trying to determine which runtime to use based on, like, maybe you need to support the most amount of Node possible, but you maybe want your app to run faster and you want to use a different runtime, or you prefer a different DX. This might give you a nice breakdown of that. A cool TypeScript tip Gabriel shared was why type catalogs can be better than type unions. You probably know a type union is where you say like string or number, and it uses that vertical pipe symbol. So a type catalog, Dr. Axel sort of described it as an enum for types. So you could say this type catalog contains typings for these different unions, but it's not declared as a union. You like index into it. So you say, let's say that you wanted to do a discriminated union on animals, right? You might have an animal is a type fish or dog or cat. And you would normally do that using a type union syntax. But with a type catalog, you would say type animal equals, and then you give it an object, and you define like the shape of the object where you say cat is type cat or dog is type dog, and then you can index into it. So Gabriel explains a little bit more about why that can be better and has some extra benefits than just plain type union. So you can go check that thread out. Another cool thing, Mattia made a library that can map JSON to classes and strongly type it for you. So this would be like a mapping library. And now I don't use too many classes in TypeScript with my normal app development, like my web dev. But in game dev, we use classes all the time. This could be super useful if you need to map some data structure that is not inside of TypeScript to TypeScript, you TypeScript classes. For example, Erik, when we integrate with Tiled, which is a map editor, they export a JSON file. And so what his library lets you do is you can just suck that in and you give it like, here's my class I want it to map to, and it does all the mapping for you. So you don't have to go through and assign properties manually, which is what I do when I'm working with mapping stuff from my API to a class.
Oh, I wish this existed before my rewrite of the tiled library and it's not a bad thing because now I like understand the tiled map format like intimately well. And I used Zod for that. And I wound up rewriting it because I needed to also support the XML side of it as well. So I convert the XML by hand to, I'm calling it the canonical shape, which is the JSON format. And then I convert that into a strongly typed shape using Zod.
Nice. Oh, and speaking of that, the other thing that was sort of newsy that came out, but from the community, is that there's a new thing called standard schema, and it is trying to unify these different validation schema libraries. So you might have heard of, obviously we've talked about Zod a little bit. There's also one called Archetype, and then another one called Valibot. And I think those are the three sort of most popular ones. And so the creators of each of those all came together and said, hey, what if we unify the API between our different libraries so that people can interop between them? So you could basically switch them out and get like a base, like a common base basically for each of these. So they came out with standard schema, which they announced. You can read a little bit more about that. And I think we would love to do a deep dive into these validation schema libraries. So I don't know enough to like comment fully on it, but hopefully we can just do a deep dive later. We can learn more about that. And finally, well, no episode would be complete without a Dr. Axel Corner. So he had a post recently on read-only accessibility in TypeScript. It's a great guide. Not only does he cover like the read-only keyword, he covers in different contexts in which you can use it. So you can create read-only class properties, read-only arrays, and all sorts of cool stuff. So he's a nice complete guide on using that.
Yeah, this is super useful, especially for me when I have an array that I don't expect my consumers to, I don't want them to tamper with it.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is the array, but if you're not careful, you pass them a mutable array and they can mess with it. And then bad things happen because it's violated your assumption inside of your library. That array is not going to be messed with.
Yep. Yeah, read-only stuff. I'm used to doing that in .NET, passing interfaces that don't have add and remove mutation methods on them. But native arrays in JavaScript, you can push pop, you can mutate them. You can technically still do that in TypeScript, but now with TypeScript, you can say, no, just treat this as a read-only array so that it'll at least throw a compiler error if people try to do that.
Yeah, you got to be on purposely doing the bad thing, like casting things around in order to like push and pop and do the bad thing.
Yep. Sweet. Well, are we ready to dive into the main topic today, which is ORMs, and WTF is an ORM?
What the friend?
WTF stands for what the friend, because this is a friendly podcast. But what does ORM stand for, and what are they used for?
Yeah. So this is maybe a contentious topic if y'all are familiar with ORMs, but if you're not, it stands for object relational mappers. And roughly speaking, they are a mechanism for converting like objects, as you might know them in JavaScript or .NET or Java, and converting them into a like table format for a database, the relational table. And so hence the object relational mapper. There is like a very valid criticism of ORMs, which is they are an impedance mismatch. Like object-oriented programming and relational don't map to each other very well. So there are necessarily leaky abstractions causing some friction. So that is a thing to be aware of. And I know a lot of people have a lot of feelings about ORMs, but I think one thing that is good about them is they encourage strongly typed access to your database. And in this case, we're going to be talking about TypeScript ORMs. And there's a lot of different ways that they can help you. First off, ORMs can either be code first or database first. And what I mean by that is if they're code first, you might define like everything about your database in the code, which you need a high degree of discipline as a team to not destroy production. Like you might define your indexes, your schemas, everything inside of your code. Or you might do database first, which is, okay, the database exists and is managed through another thing. And we are going to go and inspect that database and produce our types, our TypeScript types. And they can be super useful for handling hydration of entities. So you're doing queries. And if you were doing it old school, you would have to go and one by one pick out the columns of your rows and hydrate your objects. So they can do that for you. They can do like super useful things like handling like boilerplate, like auto IDs, for example. And they're really great for like data modeling potentially. Like they can represent database objects as code without you having to write that relationship in code. But again, leaky abstractions. And Kamran, when was the first time you used an ORM?
Well, that would be when I was using .NET when we were working together at General Mills, because we had been using SQL Server and then we were writing .NET C# code against it. So I think this brings up like, what's the world like without an ORM? So that world looks like writing SQL by hand, right? So writing your select statements, learning T-SQL, and understanding how that language works just in order to get data from your database in order to spit it out on screen. So I think it arose from a pain point, which is like, why do I need to learn yet another thing? Like I have to learn about this database and how it works specifically just to get some data out of it and to put data into it. And so ORMs abstract that for you. So you can say, I can just define my C# class, which represents my table. And it also generates a class for me that I could just get data for me, get data by ID, and I'm done. The problem is that's what it's like for simple problems. But then as soon as you start creating more complex apps, and a lot of these were enterprise applications, so we're talking dozens of tables, if not hundreds of tables, and dealing with lots and lots of data, those abstractions start to get in the way where you just end up needing to diagnose and debug them anyway at the end of the day because they're generating queries for you. And then you're wondering why those queries are taking a minute to complete. And so you have to look at the queries it generates. And then now you're in a position where the ORM is working against you. I want to optimize this specific query, but the ORM doesn't let me do that. And I think that's what it was like back then. We were using Entity Framework, and I know a lot of people still use Entity Framework in .NET. But I think what we're going to talk about here with some of these ORMs is that there's like a spectrum of how abstract they are. So some of them are less abstract, where it is more similar to writing SQL, but they don't interface with as many databases, versus ones that are super abstract, where they basically have their own domain-specific language for how you do queries, and they can interact with lots of different databases, but it's really abstract and it's hard to optimize. So it's that trade-off, basically. So,
yeah. I think, like, when should you use an ORM? And I think, like, based on what you're talking about, I think they work really well for CRUD. So if you're doing, like, very CRUD-ish type things, like create, what is it? Create, read, update, delete.
Yes.
So you're working with very discrete, like maybe one table, maybe two, very low complexity problems. They do save you a lot of time and boilerplate code because they can do this mapping for you. And they also do a lot of sanitization too for you. So they also save you some security, thinking about security. I think when you shouldn't, and there's no reason you can't like do both. Like you can do an ORM for the simple things and then do the not ORM for the complicated things. So I think where you probably should look at writing your own SQL is if you have a high complexity data environment where performance is important. I think that's where you're going to need to write your own queries. There's just no other way, especially like if you're looking at doing reporting type solutions, like that's really tough for an ORM to do well. And then between versions of an ORM, the query generation might change and the behavior will be different in terms of performance. Like it might still be correct behavior in terms of data, but it might be different in terms of like performance characteristics. And to cap it off around like ORMs is Martin Fowler had a great article called ORM Hate. And I think he summarized the whole article best as ORMs help us deal with very real problems for most enterprise applications. And they are often misused. And sometimes the problem can be avoided and they're not pretty, but then the problems that we're dealing with aren't pretty either. So they deserve more respect and a little more understanding, which I totally agree with. So I think tool for the job. And you know what? It might not be the right tool for your job.
Yeah, I think I was watching, and we have a link to this in the show notes. The Primeagen has a reaction video on a blog post titled Don't Use an ORM. And I think one of the things that he says that I think is true is because you're going to be dropping down to the SQL anyway at the end of the day when you're trying to debug issues with your ORM, like it makes sense to just learn the SQL. And that is not something that's very palatable, I would say, especially for like beginners or entry level developers, even senior developers. Like, do I really want to learn SQL? The answer is no, I don't really want to learn it. But the issue is that there's not really shortcuts when it comes to optimizing those queries. So unfortunately, your data access depends on SQL. And if you're going to outsource all of that to your ORM, you're beholden to it. And so you might get stuck in a situation where you can't optimize it because you don't understand what it's actually doing under the hood. And oh my, what a metaphor for dealing with LLMs too. And like the LLM is spitting out code and you're like, I don't understand what it's doing, but it works. And that's similar to an ORM. Like, I don't understand what query it's writing, but it works. And some of those queries get super gnarly. And I've always had to drop down into the SQL and customize it. And then you end up doing weird things where you're like, we need to invoke the query in this special way using the ORM with these flags, or we have to write it in a specific structure so that it outputs the right query. Otherwise, it's going to be an unoptimized query. And at that point, you might as well just write the raw SQL.
I agree.
And I think one of the things that he brings up is that the tools to help you build better queries are good, right? But there's a difference between having so much abstraction where it's a different language versus something that just helps you build better query. So he makes a distinction between SQL builders and ORMs. And we're going to talk about a few of the different options, but there are some options in the TypeScript ORM landscape that are more of SQL builders. So you are closer to the actual SQL language where it helps you become a better SQL developer versus tries to hide everything from you. And I think that's really where the distinction is. And now as like a developer who's been doing this for many years, I feel like I'm much more on the side of I want less abstraction in my life than more. Whereas at the beginning of my career, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. So I do actually prefer a high level abstraction from stuff. And I think that's where there's a range of people, right? So that are going to be listening to this to be like, I don't want to learn SQL. So I kind of want that high level of abstraction. And I think that's fine. You just have to realize that at some point you might be tasked with going down to the details to optimize something. And that's where you're going to have to learn it.
I'd say like when you're evaluating any tool, like especially these, I think you want the ability to like thunk down to the bottom and have an escape hatch. It's like, okay, I'm using Entity Framework, yada, yada, yada. I want the ability if I need to write just SQL because I need to accomplish something. So I think if you're looking at one of these tools, having the ability to open the escape hatch and just write the query is another thing to think about, because then you can live in both worlds.
Yes. And I think I just want to be clear that I did use a ORM for a long time. I used Entity Framework for my app for keep track of my games because I was working against a SQL database. But the reason I'm not using an ORM right now is because I switched from using a relational database to a document database. And I find with that, it's a much more like one-to-one relationship between my object model and what I store in the database. It's essentially just JSON that I'm getting back and serializing and deserializing. There's no need for an ORM because the database client is good enough where it slightly abstracts it, but it's not a leaky abstraction. That's just how I store my data. And so part of this, I think, is what Martin Fowler is saying is that an unavoidable problem, like you can make it avoidable if you maybe change the way that you architect your app. So we always reach for SQL and relational databases first. I feel like that's just a de facto thing. But like personally, I would never go back to relational if it were up to me. Like I love working in NoSQL. And because of that, I don't have a mapping layer in my app. It's just a lot simpler to think about and conceptualize and store data. That's part of it too, is like you're using an ORM because you chose to use a relational database, maybe the problem is that for some types of data, you don't need a relational database. Maybe you want something else. Maybe you want a graph database. Maybe you want a time series database. Maybe you want something else that's better suited for the job.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Exactly. So if you're dealing with objects, maybe you want objects.
To
But
store objects, yeah.
on the flip side, if you're dealing with reporting and you're dealing with doing aggregations, maybe you want relational actually, because it works really well for those things.
Yep.
And things like document databases don't do super hot when you're trying to do aggregations across multiple documents. You really, in a document database, this is overgeneralizing, you really want to optimize for putting the data that you need in a single document. So you only have to do one read.
Yeah, and it totally depends because the database I use, which is RavenDB, is really good at aggregations. What I will say is that in any NoSQL database, as far as I know, referential integrity is the trade-off that you make. Because in like my database, if I update an entity and I have that entity field on a different document, I have to manually go and update that document's reference. So you know what I mean? Where if you imagine the quintessential order document that contains order line items and it has your product name there. But if you go and update the product name and the product catalog, you have to make an architectural choice now. Do you want the order document to be a point in time snapshot where that's just the product name at the time that you bought it?
Which might be desirable.
It might be desirable. And that's good. And the document database is great at that. That's what it excels at. But I have cases where, no, it actually does need to be referential and I want to update that related item. I have to manually do that in a NoSQL document database. These are the trade-offs that you make.
Right. Yeah. Moving into maybe more practical possibilities for TypeScript. There's a few out there, TypeScript ORMs, that you can take a look at. And this is not really meant to be a deep dive, but this is like an overview of the landscape that's out there right now. And I'll just caveat, this is probably not an exhaustive list, but it's the list of things that kind of bubbled to the top when we were doing research.
Yep.
So I think the first one, and one that's really popular, at least in my sphere, is Drizzle. And they're very much like that SQL. Like we want SQL to be the thing that's powering this. So we want to do things like, and it's more, if I understand it correctly, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it's more of that mapper aspect rather than an ORM.
Yeah, you essentially, it showed the code side by side with here's how you write a query in Drizzle, and here's the equivalent SQL, and it's essentially identical, right? You're using a function name like .select and .from or .where, and you are writing queries like that. And so what they say, even straight up in their documentation, is we embrace SQL and built Drizzle to be SQLite at its core. So you can have 0 to no learning curve and access the full power of SQL. And that resonates with me as someone who wants less abstraction in their life because it's closer to the metal, but it gives you those niceties where that's what we're talking about, is that it's more of a SQL builder. So you still have to do a left join or you still have to do a group by, but it helps you with type safety, IntelliSense, generating that schema and all those niceties, but then is not like a super high level abstraction where you have to learn a brand new domain specific language.
Yeah. One thing that really grabbed me when I was looking at Drizzle is their getting started was awesome. So you can click on their getting started and they have this kind of whole wizard of, hey, are you using an existing database or a new database? And they also have a pretty impressive list of things that they support, from your more traditional Postgres and MySQL to SQLite, to various other engines that they support. And then they support a lot of different cloud hosted versions of these options. So I know Neon is a very popular Postgres host, and so is Supabase. But the other cool thing is, so if you click on this, I'm going to use an existing database, I have my own hosted Postgres. What you can do is you can have Drizzle go and do database introspection and then spit out types that are your Postgres database, which is super slick. That's one of the biggest things for doing maintenance on ORMs. You don't want to spend your time hammering out just boilerplate types for a database that already exists.
Yeah.
You want it to go and figure that out for you.
That's one nice thing, is that this is not something that you have to commit to for the full life of your project. It seems like you could just use Drizzle to get that initial API schema just built from your database if you've got an existing one. And then at that point, you can just be like, I want to continue using Drizzle, or I'm good. Like, I got my types. I'll just keep them up to date after that. But it is pretty sweet. A lot of these ORMs, including Drizzle, support migrations, which I think that has always been a big pain point with relational databases, because we know that your schema drifts over time, right? Like, you've got new business requirements, you got to add new columns, or an existing column needs to be changed. And that is a huge headache. What these ORMs allow you to do is define those migrations in code. And so you can go up or down, where you could say, for this release, we need to modify the table schema, and it takes care of updating all of your existing data without losing it. And so that's really nice too.
Yeah. And that's totally optional in Drizzle. So, but what you were describing is like a code first approach, where you're like, okay, I want to manage the entire database in Drizzle. So I don't want to use like another tool. I like Drizzle to manage my database, and Drizzle can do that. And like, from that initial generation of the schema, you can go ahead and make your migrations, the update to the schema. And looking at the code, it's actually pretty slick. It looks like a lot like Zod, but with database parlance instead of Zod. And then the opposite of that is, okay, we would just be doing the Drizzle pull and just living in a different tool. I mean, and it depends on your enterprise, because depending on your enterprise, like your DBAs or your change control wants to do something different. And so the database is the source of truth, and you need to adapt your app to it.
One notable thing for Drizzle is that because it is so close to a SQL-like experience, they only support relational databases. So that could be a deal breaker if you need to support MongoDB. But that's when we go to the other side of the spectrum. So the popular option there would be Prisma. And Prisma does support not only relational databases, but they also support NoSQL databases like Mongo. This is super similar, where you can do the database introspection, so you can generate your Prisma types from your database, and is, I think, another super popular option if you prefer interfacing with your database through that domain-specific language, because the way that you do queries there is you don't use select statements or the select API. You basically do a declarative. I guess if you're used to using Mongo, it's pretty similar the way that you do queries there, where you basically create an object that's your query, and then it takes care of abstracting that.
Yeah, it's very much like active record style API, where you have the object that represents your user, and then you have methods that hang off of that to get at user instances from your database. Mm-hmm. What active record's all about. It does. I'm looking at the code right now for like how to use it, and I'm like, oh, this definitely looks like the Mongo client. It is very similar to my eyes. It's very funny. And then looking at the database introspection for Prisma, which is, I think, really, like, for me, is a deal breaker if it doesn't have it. I feel like I need some form of database introspection, versus I don't want to waste my time hammering out types. As much as I love doing that, if I can have something go and do it for me, yes, please. Yeah. I'd say my only knock, and this is maybe not a knock for most people, is that the schemas it generates are like a .prisma file, not like a TypeScript file like they would be in Drizzle, where they're a TypeScript DSL, but it's still TypeScript, versus like Prisma, where it's a Prisma DSL in a .prisma file, which, yay or nay. Advantage to having your own DSL is you can represent the things that you want to represent, regardless of the constraints of the language you're writing in. Downside is now you need tooling to deal with .prisma files.
Yeah, I think I had noted down here that to me, it felt like Prisma could be a good fit if you run multiple types of databases and you want that level of abstraction over them. So this could be a nice fit if you have a bunch of microservices, right? That maybe one uses Redis, one uses Postgres, and I don't know, one uses Mongo, which was pretty common at Target, where we would run against multiple databases. And maybe you just want to unite all of your microservices under one data abstraction, like data ORM, so that all your teams, like, you can have people move between teams and they can understand the data layer, like then you might want to use something like Prisma versus with Drizzle, where you just have to be like the microservice that goes against Mongo doesn't use Drizzle, uses something else. And then you have to learn multiple technologies. So it could be like that kind of use case. Seems like it could make a lot of sense for Prisma. And again, if maybe you need to work with multiple languages, Prisma could be super helpful.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. So that's like another advantage of it.
There is another aspect of this too, which is Prisma is just more than the ORM. It is a full company, and they've got Prisma Postgres, which is, I think, their serverless offering. So you can deploy your Postgres using Prisma. And so they've got these suite of different tools that kind of work together. Whereas Drizzle is really that's just the ORM. It's not like a full startup / company, infrastructure company around it.
Yeah, that's a good call out. Prisma is definitely in that startup mode. But as far as I know, they're doing very well. And I think they're very much a trusted Postgres host. So that might be a thing if you are in the market, regardless of whether or not you want an ORM, but if you're in the market for a Postgres database, Prisma might be the thing that you want, especially compared to AWS pricing. Just voice of experience, AWS and Postgres and its tools are not awesome. I'll just put it that way. Not awesome. Room for improvement.
They're suboptimal, as we like
to
say.
They're suboptimal. So Prisma might be like, oh, hey, I'm not like in the market for an ORM, but I am in the market for hosting a Postgres database. And so Prisma is very popular. And I know Neon is also another popular one too.
Cool. There's a couple more TypeScript-based ORMs to talk about. Do you want to talk about Mikro? And that's MIKRO ORM.
Yeah. So MikroORM is a TypeScript, and this is their byline, a TypeScript ORM for Node.js based on the data mapper unit of work pattern. So this is very much in the family of entity framework. So if you had ever been a .NET developer and you were doing like entity framework, roughly speaking, when you were using that, you would have repositories for classes of objects, and then you do a bunch of things that would be your unit of work, and then you would commit and it would figure it out and do all the things to your database that you wanted to do. And that's exactly what MikroORM is. Their API, though, I'd say is way better than entity frameworks. Their example is super nice. They have hey, I'm going to go iterate through my list of cars that I searched for. I'm going to go poke properties on multiple models that I got back out of my repository. I'm going to go do some other things to those models. I'm going to go poke some other stuff on maybe like my users table. And then I'm going to go ahead and flush, which is going to go ahead and go and figure out and do all of the things to the database I need to do, which is awesome. It also could be like, it could also be dangerous, but it is pretty awesome, especially if you're like, I don't have to think about how to rectify my model changes in my TypeScript with my database changes I need to make. Super slick.
But this supports migrations as well. I think that's one thing we're seeing across all these ORMs is that it's pretty much table stakes that they all support migrations.
Yeah. And personal experience too, like migrations are table stakes, but also you need a team with discipline that will also implement the down, not just the up on your migrations.
Yeah.
Especially if you're like in a shop that is doing continuous delivery and you only ever implement the up, you're in trouble when you mess up. Or you need to be very sure that your ups are always backwards compatible, which puts you in a different world, which is totally fine. And in fact, that's how we operate, is to try and make things as backwards compatible as possible. But you also need to be aware of that leaky abstraction of, I suddenly made a column non-null. What effect does that have on production? Things like that.
I think we haven't talked about how you would use this in practice, but we always separated out development database from production database. And as developers, we actually never had permission to alter schema in production. So we could use entity framework code first for development, and we could use it for the dev database. But actually what we had to do was we had to create the diff script, and then we had to send it to the DBAs, and they would review it, and then they would make the updates to production, which was kind of nice because I didn't want to mess up prod. These were like million user databases and stuff, like millions of people were hitting it every day. And so I don't want to be responsible for that. But that is in that big context of we have a DBA team. So you need to have some discipline if you're going to be running these migrations in production.
And a lot of this conversation is not just specific to one tool. I think this applies to a lot of tools.
Yes.
Especially when you're working with databases. It's just, there's a lot of like foot gun potential in a database. And if you're just not, honestly, a lot of it is you just got to make the mistake and then learn from it, because mistakes are the best teacher. Unfortunately, pain is a great teacher. So if you make a mistake, arguably there are some mistakes you don't want to make that are hard to recover from, especially around databases.
Always have backups.
Yeah, always have backups. And one funny one is backups don't exist until you try to restore them. Mm-hmm. So it's Heisenberg's backup is if you have a backup strategy, but if you've never tried to restore one, you don't actually have backups.
Yeah.
More on MikroORM, getting back to the topic, is they definitely use an interesting way of defining your entities is they use decorator based. So you decorate your TypeScript classes. And this is nice because there's no weird like DSL in terms of I need to go call this function and develop the schema kind of in terms of like a Zod style. Like I'm going like schema. I'm providing this JSON object that describes my schema. Some people may or may not like that. This is just a plain old TypeScript class with decorators on it. So if you have a user entity, you have an @entity decorator on the top. If you have a primary key, you have an @primary key, and you have different columns. You do @property, and you can do all kinds of cool things. Like you can do many-to-one relationships. You can define it really does remind me of Entity Framework in a lot of ways, because in Entity Framework code first, you would do a lot of this kind of stuff.
Yes. And that brings us to another alternative called TypeORM. Again, it supports data mapper and the active record patterns. So if you like both of those patterns, MikroORM, TypeORM, those ones might be more for you. This TypeORM is also decorator based. And so in the last episode, we talked about stage 3 decorators. This is a good example of how they work. And so you can definitely do that. They also support defining the entity schemas separately. So if you're like, I don't want to use decorators for whatever reason, you can define your schemas separately using their Fluent API. And it's got TypeScript support. And notably, TypeORM has NoSQL MongoDB support. And I don't know, does MikroORM support MongoDB?
Yeah, so they do support Mongo in their documentation. So there's a full list of available drivers. So they support SQL and NoSQL.
Nice. Okay. If you are working with MongoDB, at least at the moment, Prisma, MikroORM, and TypeORM are definitely alternatives you can check out. What are some maybe lesser known ORMs or some other ORMs that came to the top in your research?
Yeah, there's one that a few people on the Discord mentioned, and that's Convex. Now, Convex is an interesting one because it's its own database. This is one that's very specialized as well, and it's very aligned with React. So if you're like a React-ish or React-like dialect kind of person, this might be something to look at. It is its own database, and it is not open source. It's a functional source license that ages into Apache 2 after 2 years. So if I'm remembering right, this is very much like Terraform, where they age into a different license after 2 years. But you can self-host the Convex backend, so you can test locally. You don't need to be like hitting their API. It works. It provides like a relational data model, and it's very JSON-like documents, and it can be used with or without a schema. So their byline just works, air quotes, and they tout predictable query performance. This looks like a thing if I need to slap together an app really fast and I like React and I don't really care too much about my database and I'm willing to use this pseudo proprietary database, then let's go for it. No.
Yeah, I think that it's an alternative to Firebase, and it's similar to that. So when you say it's its own DB, that's also called like a backend as a service. So Firebase, it is very tightly integrated with the code, like it's its own API. There's no adapter. It works with it. Like they provide the SDK client and then it's its own ORM on top of itself. It's not Convex is not an ORM library that can interface with multiple databases. It's the Convex.
Yeah.
So similar to Firebase. If you don't like Firebase and you want to try something else, I think Convex is an alternative to that.
And there's a few more that we'll mention here. I think the next up is sequelize, is one of the first, I think, on the scene in the kind of the Node.js ORMs. I could be wrong about that, but it does support TypeScript. It does require a little bit of effort to do, but it also can connect to anything. And I think a lot of the other ORMs out there are built on top of sequelize. They leverage sequelize under the hood. So it's battle tested, and you can connect to DB2.
Your mainframe, if you gotta write TypeScript against your mainframe, you can use sequelize.
I need to connect to some IBM DB2, please. Sequelize for the win.
That's hilarious. You've got a few other small ones. We probably don't need to go too much into them, but just mention them for if people want to look into them.
Yeah, there's Objection.js, another one that can support TypeScript. There's also Connects, which I've used it in the past, and I think it's gotten a lot better, but I have scar tissue. Like, I was using a very old version of Connects, and I didn't have a good time with it, but it's probably better now. I think they've had several versions since I last used it, and it supports TypeScript now. The version I used didn't in the past, so that might also be partially why I didn't like it. There's a few more: Waterline, Bookshelf, and then there's Mongoose/TypeGoose. You could guess which one has types, but those are some other honorable mentions to check out if you're looking for a way to operate against databases in TypeScript.
Nice. How do we want to wrap this up? What are the takeaways for when to use like a TypeScript ORM and when not to?
I think, again, it really boils down to two factors in my mind. Is one, use what makes you happy and productive. So factor one. And two, use the right tool for the job. So if you're doing something like, I want to do reporting, maybe you need to stick to one of the lighter ORMs where you're more close to the SQL. But if you're doing more CRUD, maybe that aligns more with some of these more mapping, more object-y type ORMs.
Yeah, I think one of our favorite things to say to each other and to our teammates is, what problem are we trying to solve? You're reaching for this library. You want to use Drizzle. You want to use Prisma. What problem are we trying to solve? And is that the right tool to solve that problem?
Exactly. I think that's super important to be asking yourself for any technology, not just because it's cool or the shiny thing, or you have some resume-driven development that you want to do.
Very nice. What do we got for Secrets of the Handbook today?
Yeah, so this is very cool. I've picked out nominal typing, and this can be done using something called branded types. And it's pretty simple. The idea is you make a type that you intersect with some additional information. So what does that mean? So for example, if I want to make like an ID, and then I want to say, I don't want all IDs to be treated the same. Like this is a customer ID. I don't want it to match like my product ID. I don't want to accidentally have a bug where I mismatch my customer and my product ID. So one way to do that is to say, okay, I'm going to make a customer ID type. Customer ID equals, let's say it's a string. I'm going to do a type intersection and give it a brand. So I'm going to say, I'm going to give it a brand, which is open close mustaches. And I'm going to go __ brand customer ID string literal. So that way, when I'm using customer IDs, I can't assign them to things that aren't customer IDs. So this is kind of a hack that is now well known and supported by TypeScript for making what's known as nominal types, which is, instead of TypeScript normally operates, is structural types, which is if it has the same shape, it's the same thing. In this case, if it has the same name, it's the same thing, versus, because these are all strings at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
Now they have the same name, so that they're the same thing, but if they have a different name, they're different things.
Okay, so I would use this if I want to distinguish a special string from another type of string. Where,
exactly,
like you said, I want to have a method or a function that accepts a customer ID. I don't want that to just be typed as string because you could pass in any type of string. I want to force the caller to pass in a customer ID type, which is still a string, but it's a branded string, a branded type.
Exactly.
Cool.
And it still has all of the string methods on it according to TypeScript. So it still behaves like a string. Some of the downsides is you need to construct them in odd ways. So you need to do like a factory function that will validate and cast to your branded type. And as long as your team is not casting your branded types around, then they work. So for example, you might like in Excalibur, we have like create ID function that does this exact thing. So I say create ID, I give it a number and I give it an ID type. And this is just a string literal. So create ID, some number, and collider. So like this is a collider ID and I cannot use it by accident somewhere else, which has been a source of bugs for me in the past. So that's generally like the way that folks do it. And I will definitely point some people at a couple of resources, especially Josh Goldberg's Learning TypeScript book, Josh has a very large article about branded types and the pros and cons and ways of doing it and things that are out there in the wild. Really great way to do it. In his example, he uses currency. So like they make a currency that is either euro or US dollar. You don't want to cross those wires. That would be an expensive bug potentially, especially if you're working with currency. So these are ideas.
Okay. Now, devil's advocate, why can't I just use a class? Why can't I just create a customer ID class? Because wouldn't that give me the same benefits?
I think you could do that. I think it's just a little more clunky than passing things around. Also, you don't get necessarily the same like equivalence operators like you'd have to implement that. So if you wanted to check if two IDs are the same, you would have to implement that in your class, which is totally fine. And I'm sure plenty of people do that. And like that's in the parlance that would be called like boxing. So like a boxed number, you would create a box for this. And that's totally fine. And honestly, I think that would be a totally acceptable way to do it, especially if you have something that's a little more nuanced than just it boils down to a string or a number. I think that'd be a totally fine way to do it.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand when it makes sense to use these. That's cool.
Yeah. So this branding thing can be used for some more interesting behavior. This is a buyer beware hack, but I'll include a link to it, but you can use branded types to implement a type of sealed class. So this is like a thing where you need a method to be public, but you don't want people to extend it. And I think in Java, it might be called final. In C# it's called sealed, but it basically means that, hey, I have this object and I do not want anyone to override the update method, for example. I want that to be always the implementation that I provided. And I'm advertising directly that I don't want anyone to mess with it. Mm-hmm. So there's a way to do this. And the way to do it is your brand, instead of branding it to like branded like string, your brand is a unique symbol that you do not export out of your file. So there is no way for someone else to produce that same symbol. So there is no way to extend that method. And I can't explain the code to you. It's a little complicated, but that's the idea.
So this is using ES symbol, like the symbol type, right? And for someone that's not familiar with symbols or haven't worked with symbols, they are like a way, I don't even know how you would describe them. They're like unique instances of things, and they can be used to uniquely identify something. If you create a new symbol, you're guaranteed that is unique. And so you can compare two symbols to each other. And if they're not the same symbol, you get a false. But if they are the same symbol, you get a true. You can't replace the value of them. I don't know. They're hard to describe, I guess.
Yeah, you can't construct a new symbol that is the same value as an existing one.
Yeah.
You can only pass them around.
Yep.
So like in this situation, we are not exporting the symbol out of the class file. So there's no way for anyone to produce the same symbol. So there's no way to extend the method.
Yep. There is some dark magic that I actually use in my own app where you can technically create singletons using symbols in JavaScript, but I might just link to that because it's nuts. Alrighty. I got a couple cool things that I saw this week. So related to this whole discussion of ORMs, there's a video by Codapp's Academy on Drizzle versus Prisma. And I really liked his explanation of that spectrum of translation we were talking about. In other words, Drizzle is more literal, with a one-to-one mapping of TypeScript to the SQL versus Prisma, which is much more abstract and has its own domain-specific language, but that allows them to interop with more databases. So he goes into some of the details there of like when you might prefer one over the other, what do their APIs look like against each other, and like how you would make a decision on which one is right for you. So you can definitely check that out. The other thing I saw over on Reddit, in the TypeScript subreddit, the person who wrote Jet Validators, which is a collection of boilerplate validator functions, released a new version. So these would be things like is Boolean, is number, is not empty, and some other like validator functions written in TypeScript. And you might use these if you don't want to adopt a full-on validation schema library like Zod. Maybe you just want to be able to just import some of these guard functions and use them. In the past, I've used Lodash, where I've done is undefined or like some of those validator helpers. So this is its own library. You can check that out if that sounds pretty cool.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely am going to be looking at the Jet validators and probably just stealing the implementations. But this is really slick, especially when you're like in that loosey-goosey JavaScript way and you need to have a type, like you need to have more guarantees about your type at runtime. This is super useful. And then you can write a type guard or a type assertion, like so that you can be very confident that the type in your block is what you expect it to be.
Yes. And you don't have to go and write it yourself. Alrighty. I think that's a wrap on the episode. You want to say goodbye and we'll see you guys later and have an excellent day or night depending on your time zone.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Hi everyone, this is Kamran. I just wanted to thank you for listening to the show and we hope you enjoyed the episode. If you want to see the show notes, you can check your podcast player or go to typescript.fm where you'll see a list of all the episodes. If you enjoyed the show, tell your friends and please rate it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify because that's how the show grows and gets discovered by more people. If you want to suggest news or a project that should be covered or just want to say hi, email us at feedback@typescript.fm. If you want to follow us on social, we're both active on Blue Sky. I'm at comronicus.com and Erik is at ericonerheim.com. You can also follow the show directly at typescript.fm.